welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see a bunch of old friends here and people I used to work with and all sorts of things, so it's great to see everybody. I'm leaving the lights on for a couple of minutes because Jason needs to take some pictures. There, perfect.
One of those.
Just tell me whenever you're ready.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm gonna be talking today about 3 settlements that became Prince Albert, and I want to welcome you to the first coffee and conversation of the winter season, fall and winter season, because tomorrow winter starts, I think, right? What? Today is the last nice day, so thanks for coming on this last nice day. Anyway, so before I forget, because Jason nicely reminded me, we have another one in a month.
Either way.
Michael. It's Michael. Not Jason.
Sorry.
Hey, at least you're confusing me with somebody who works at my office. So
That's what I did. I meant Jason. Anyway.
she's thinking of the editor and not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mike.
Okay, sorry, Connie.
I can't remember what I was going to say. Oh yeah, the next one.
Yes.
The next one. So the next one, just make sure I don't forget this at the end. Anne Harinyuk, who is from Larange, has written a history of Larange. And she's going to do the next presentation at the, which will be
You're
the
good for
last
killing lights now.
Saturday of, or Sunday of October. And it'll be in all our advertising and so on. Okay. 3 settlements that became Prince Albert. So we normally don't think of Prince Albert as being sort of 3 things. It's not, but when I started by researching the Hudson Bay Company a few years ago, and some of you may have come to one of the presentations I did on that. And I got interested in Goschen, and then I started looking at how things developed, and as I learned more and more about it and found things like this particular little map here, which we'll look at again as the presentation goes on, you really could see physically that it was 3 separate things that eventually came together to be the city. So, but before people settled here, we all know that First Nations came here and used this area, which is a big flats, a nice big flats, and I'm sure before people were here it was full of berries and it was full of all sorts of things, and the buffalo crossed not far down the river that way. They crossed the river often to get north whenever they were, because the buffalo had a kind of long migration route, different herds did. And there was a buffalo crossing kind of not far from where you're talking about that mill at the end there, which the map's a little blurry, it's not the best picture. It's a hand-drawn map, but that says Moore's lumber mill. I think it's Moore, right? Yeah. And kind of in that area is where there was a buffalo crossing. So anyway, First Nations would come here for periods of time, mostly in the summer, collect here, eat berries, celebrate, probably intermarry. So lots of interesting things happened here before people settled. There was...
Were they not people?
What's that?
Were they not people?
Yes, settled, before people settled.
Oh, sorry.
Before people settled, not before people, before people settled.
Okay.
There was a trading post, probably again, as many of you know, at kind of around the mouth of the Shell River, which was the Peter Pond trading post. But that didn't last very long either. So the first guy, as many of you know, was, so this is Kistapananic, and it was very seasonal. And then Isbister came. So James Isbister was a Métis guy from Red River, but he worked for the Hudson Bay Company. And many of the Hudson Bay Company employees originated in the Orkney Islands in Scotland. And, but not all of them. Like Olaf Olsen, who came with Isbister, and actually stayed in this area for a long time. He had descendants. I think he's buried at South Hill Cemetery. He was a Scandinavian guy. So anyway, they came and settled, and they made their living in a lot of different ways. They worked part-time for the Hudson Bay Company or full-time. They traded, they hunted, they fished, they took a river lot here on what is now the kind of the west end of town. Have any of you walked along the Rotary Trail at the west end to see the sign with the Isbister? Because he's now, I'll talk about it at the end, but he's a person of historic interest. And there's a memorial, big sign down there, where his first river lot was. So after 1869-70, more and more Métis kept moving west. It became unpleasant for them in Red River. Lots of Ontario and Quebec settlers were moving in. The Métis, a lot of them pushed west. The French Métis in this area went to the Duck Lake, Batoche area. The English Métis came up here to a great extent. Here, Red Deer Hill, Lindsay, some of those areas, Halcrow, all of those areas were mostly English, descendants of English Métis. So, that's a picture of Isbister. So Isbister stayed here, although he took a second river lot further west in an area called St. Catharines. There was a church there that burnt down. When I first moved to PA, it was in about the mid-1980s. Somebody put a match to that church, but there was a church. So if you keep driving west on the road out to Lily Plain, there was the area called St. Catharines. So that was Isbister's second.
Was that with the cemetery out there?
There is a cemetery there.
It's not St. Mary's Church.
No, St. Mary's,
St. Catharines.
yeah, this was St. Catharines, was further west than St. Mary's. So St. Mary's was the first Anglican church here. So it's just west of the Pen. So Isbister's settlement was a settlement that was quite spread out. There's a fair distance between St. Mary's Church and Isbister, but not a huge distance. And if we go back, I'm just gonna go back here. There were, so this is where the Pen and Isbister's was about here. There's St. Mary's Church. So there were some businesses that set up out here, but at that end. And in one of the history books, I'm kind of jumping around here, but the Clouston history book, if any of you have that. Bishop McLean, who was wrote a story in there about St. Mary's Church and the development of that area, and they called it the West End at that time. So that was quite a long time ago, but it was called the West End. It didn't last very long as kind of people thinking of it as a separate settlement, but it was a separate settlement when Nisbet came. So these are some, Emmanuel College was another place that some of you might know about. It was built again as an Anglican school. I don't want to go a lot into the history of it, but it was started in 1879. It was a school, and then it became a post-secondary theological, mostly theological college. Eventually moved to Saskatoon, and that was the beginning of the University of Saskatchewan. That was
It's the College of Emmanuel Chad now, isn't it?
yes,
Yeah.
Emmanuel St. Chad. Yeah, so it's still
Did
called.
did this area have a specific name?
It was called the West End. It was
That's
called
it.
Isbister Settlement.
Okay.
So, but it didn't last long in people's minds as a separate thing, but it lasted until PA became a town,
Yes.
and
okay.
the mission area kind of took over.
Mhm.
So it was, and it was kind of where the Anglicans lived.
Well, we think of it as the beginning of Emmanuel College.
Yeah, yeah. And James Isbister was a very solid member of the Anglican Church. He taught Anglican Sunday school and all sorts of things. So he was a big supporter of the Anglican Church. So were most of his family. So that was, and then St. Mary's, of course, was an Anglican church. This was an Anglican school and college initially. So then, and here's the map again, so you get an idea of the West End. So then when Nisbet came, he set up about a kilometer or two away, depending where you were. But so this is Central Avenue. And the Presbyterian, so then he was a Presbyterian. So that's kind of the Presbyterian part of town, was right where we are now. I'll leave it on this for a minute.
When did he come?
1866. Nisbet came in 1866. So when he first came, he brought with him John Mackay, who was an English Métis guy, and his wife, who was a sister of Nisbet's wife. So these people came in family groups. I guess when you read these, I'm not saying this just sounding like gossip. It's really important that they live together in family groups, which makes sense because we still want to do that. But they did, and they tended to live, most of the Métis lived together with sisters. Sisters would live together, because the men would be off all the time working. They're gone. They're freighting. James Isbister took flour all the way to took grain all the way to Red River at one point to grind into flour, because there was no mill here. So how long would that take you with an oxen and cart, most of the year? So he was gone, all of them were gone. They went hunting, they went fishing, they were gone. The women held down the fort, tended the gardens, took care of the kids, kept the home front going. So sisters often lived together, and then they had different husbands. So he also came, when Nisbet came, he also brought another guy with him named George Flett. And George Flett, another English Métis guy, was the interpreter, and he was the guy who really talked to the First Nations in the area to get them to agree to having a mission here, because they didn't want to just plunk a mission down, and they wanted to get the consent and the agreement of people in the area. But, they agreed, but kind of reluctantly. I'll show you this map. It's a little complicated to look at, but it's the old river lot map on top of today's Google Maps. So the arrows, this is where Isbister's first river lot was. So this is, the sign for him is along the Rotary Trail down there. Okay? And then this is where St. Mary's Church was. The river lots weren't very wide, only a couple of 100 feet wide, but very long, usually a couple of miles long, but not very wide, because river access was the important thing. So, because the river was the highway, you have to keep thinking the river's the highway. And then here is the center is further over this way.
So how old would that map be of the river lots?
1879 is our river lot map that we have, yeah. So some people might have been here and gone by then that we don't have on there, but that's
That's an
the
official
whole-
survey map?
No, I don't think it was. I don't
Didn't
think
think
they
they
were
were.
surveying till a little bit after that, although maybe it was like a first drawing of it.
So who would have made it?
I don't know who made it. I don't.
Which is the Dominion Land Surveyors were resistant to river lots at the time.
Yes, they were. It might, you know what, I bet you Lestock Reed was a surveyor, and he 1879, he was already surveying here, so I'm
Yeah.
guessing he did it.
Privately.
Yeah, that probably was him. So Nisbet came, as I said, and the local indigenous people, what George Flett said, they needed to be persuaded. Some were entirely hostile, some were indifferent, none were inviting. This was quoted in a letter from George Flett at one point. So what happened was George Flett and, as I said, John Mackay came with Nisbet, but they thought they were going to be a traveling mission. They didn't think they were going to settle. They thought they were just going to have a kind of home base and then travel out to various First Nations bands. And
This was the intention of Nisbet at the time,
And
or what, or they
Nisbet-
were meant to go further?
they were meant to go further. The Presbyterian Missionary Society thought they were going to go further. Nisbet got here and went, nah, I'm staying
This is
here.
pretty nice.
I'm staying here. And they actually had some big differences. George Flett quit and went back to Red River and did a bunch of things. He actually became an ordained minister and went and did missionary work, and so did John Mackay. But anyway, they didn't stay with Nisbet, but Nisbet decided, I'm staying here. This is going to be my town. I'm going to call it Prince Albert. And he, people started building businesses and coming. Again, because it was the right time from Red River that people were leaving. And, they'd come somewhere where there was some kind of infrastructure, as opposed to just setting up in the middle of nowhere. So that's Nisbet. He was here only for about 8 years at the most. And he died, he came in 1866, he went back to Red River, and him and his wife died within months of each other. He was in his probably 50s by then, which was pretty actually probably the life expectancy for most people at that age, or at that time. So this is a picture, we don't have a date on this picture, but that was called, it's a picture that says that's the mission house. It's a bit hard to
The
tell,
little box.
the little one with the arrow on it.
Yeah.
And you can see other buildings were already coming up, storefronts and housing.
I guess the mission house was one of the first.
It was, yeah.
On the road.
And this is, you can see, so essentially you're almost standing exactly where we're sitting right here, looking south on Central Avenue. Again, we don't have a real clear date on this, but they know it was before 1902. And then this is in 1886. So a ferry going across the river looking south. So what you're seeing is River Street for storefronts mostly at the time, and houses. People lived on River Street as well. And then the third settlement, if you keep going to the east, was called Goschen. So, oh, I misspelled that. It
Yeah.
should be Goschen.
Right down, further down
So you can see down on one of those third last bullet, it's spelled correctly. So Goschen actually, now the top Goschen spelling is how it's spelled today. Goshen Place is
Yeah.
spelled like that. That's
They incorrectly.
it's incorrect. It's, but there was a place called Goshen in the Bible. And I think that's, people didn't understand it was a different place. But the Goschen is the original name, and it was named after the guy who was the governor of the Hudson Bay Company in London, England.
at that time.
Yeah. And he was originally, he was the son of a German guy who'd immigrated to Britain in the 19th century sometime, and he became the governor of the Hudson Bay Company.
My wife was German. She said to spell Goshen without the C is quite wrong.
Yes,
Because
yes,
it's, a lot mean
yeah,
in Germany.
yeah. I doubt the city is gonna correct it now. So, anyway, in 1866, the Hudson Bay Company actually started a farm down on the west end, west of St. Mary's Church. There was a farm down there, it was called Fort Albert. So I think they used the name Albert after Prince Albert. I'm not sure where they got the name. But they wanted a little farm to provide food for Fort Carlton, mostly because there was a lot more traffic coming through Fort Carlton, and they had to feed a lot more people. So they started that farm, but in 1869 they moved it to east. And what eventually it became the Hudson Bay Company Reserve. There was 3,000 acres. And if you go make a line going south along 6th Avenue East, start at the river, and you go all the way down to the yard. I don't know if we have a line at the south end, but it goes into past, south of the A&W, and then over to not quite, or just past 15th Avenue East, but just past it. It's not really a main street in there. And that was the Hudson Bay Company Reserve. So in 1870, when they sold Rupert's land to the Canadian government, sold something they never really actually had, they were given a charter to trade in the Rupert's land, not given the land. But somehow, it just ended up being theirs.
So when you said the A&W, do you mean the A&W that's now on the highway?
Yes, yeah.
Marcus,
So that
Marcus,
whole area, like the
Yeah.
East Flat and the East Hill, really,
Yeah.
that now is
east of 6th Avenue.
Well, east of 6th Avenue,
east, okay.
east of 6th Avenue.
East.
All the way up 6th Avenue, you go past Carlton was on
Right.
it, and so was the A&W, and then just south of there somewhere is a line, wherever the
But to 15th Avenue East, that's a huge,
3,000
3,000
acres.
acres.
3,000 acres.
no, I didn't realize it went that far back.
Well,
Like-
they got a lot of land.
They got, and they got a lot more than that.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
they got, two sections in every township and,
50,000 acres around the post or something like
yeah,
that?
yeah. Anyway,
Plus
there's a
all
lot
that.
of land.
Yeah.
So, anyway, so that Goschen developed into a little town, a village, because the Hudson Bay Company set up their warehouses there. They, eventually in, I don't know when I have the year, 1872, I think, they
Yeah.
moved their headquarters from Fort Carlton to here, to Goschen. So they serviced the whole northern part of, and again, remember this was the Northwest Territories at the time, not Saskatchewan. So they moved, supported most of their northern posts north of here from Goschen. So big warehouses, workers' housing, and then people started, they had a flour mill because they needed to grind the flour here.
So
Then the steamboat started.
were they going upstream to go up the Athabasca or something?
Yeah, they would go all along up there, yeah.
Okay.
A lot of it,
Carting it north?
by freight,
Yeah.
but winter roads, they would
Okay.
use winter roads,
Yeah.
a lot of different things. 1874, the Northcote came, that was the first steamboat that came from Red River
Mhm.
up Lake Winnipeg and down the Saskatchewan. And so the steamboat landing here, which was kind of where your condo is. The condos that are on the kind of west end or east end of PA down by the river is sort of where the steamboat landing, just a little on this side of down there is where the steamboat landing was. And there were a lot of steamboats, and this was one of the major landing points.
So it was a lot of steamboat action between 1874 and
Yeah, I mean,
1885?
yeah, well, they really kind of didn't quit until they were still using steamboats for Lacole Falls
Okay.
and using that landing at Lacole Falls. So 1913, was kind of almost the end of it. And they weren't going very far anymore, it was just short trips. It's a very difficult river to run boats on because of the sandbars and stuff, and it's shallow. So this guy, Richard Deacon, was a steamboat captain. We have actually, behind the fire truck is a display on steamboats, if you ever get a chance to look at it. And Deacon was a steamboat captain, and he built this hotel. So this is around 1880, this very, very old picture.
Is that stone or brick or?
I think it was a brick hotel.
Hmm.
It doesn't show well in the picture, but the
I think
stories at
it's
the brick
stone.
hotel.
Yeah.
Well, they might have been making bricks already in
Well, okay,
1880.
I
Yeah.
don't know.
Because there were brick factories here.
Here's what it looks like from here, but maybe not.
It looks like stone, it's hard to say. Then the Methodists came, so we had the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and the Methodists. A guy named Arthur Whiteside built the first Methodist church in 1880, and that was in Goshen. So Goshen was quite a thriving community, at least equal in population to the mission, to the Prince Albert mission at the time. And there was a school, so the first one was 1884, it's the first Goshen school. And the second one was a nice brick school in 1900. So that was at 11th Avenue and 4th Street. No sign of any of this now.
No.
There's really no sign. Hudson Bay Company had a lot of buildings. Some of these are later on, but they're warehouses, they're company housing,
Winter season.
winter scene. That top one is the flour mill, and the bottom one is also the flour mill from the river. You can see that same big
The stack behind it.
stack kind of thing, yeah. So this is a different map, and again, this is your dad that drew these. It's not a very clear picture, but it's hand-drawn, so again, this was Goshen. The other thing you can see, do any of you live in that area now, east of 6th Avenue, anybody? I live in there, but Shirley lives in there, you live there, well. You can still see where the railroad lines were, if you know where to look.
Yeah.
And you can see a few things, but there's very little remnant of what Goshen actually ever was.
Well, railroad came in separately there, didn't it, at one time?
It was a spur line, I believe.
Okay, it didn't.
But there was a station. There
Yeah.
was a railway station, actually, I think on here. It's a bit hard to see this, but here, East End Railway Station.
Yeah.
So this is the exhibition grounds. So the railway station would not have been far from the school,
Did the spur line run out to the mill?
and probably ran to the mill and to the flour mill and so
Yeah.
on. I know some places where it was, I don't know where it ended.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
How did you find all these pictures, like when you were there?
just digging around in our archives, we have
Oh,
amazing
Oh,
archives.
it's just I wondered who took, I mean, it's a long time ago, I just wondered
Yeah,
who took all these
yeah.
pictures and kept them.
A company called Steel and Wings, well, yeah, a company called Steel and Wings took a whole bunch of pictures in 1891. And then there were itinerant photographers that would go around, I mean, individuals didn't have
No,
cameras,
right.
but itinerant photographers would turn up and sell these pictures, and people have just had them over the years. So it is kind of amazing how old some of them are, from the 1880s.
You never know what you'll find.
You never know what you'll find,
In any art.
yeah. So this is a picture in 1903 of Goshen. I'm not sure what they were
Looks like River
standing
Road.
on.
River Road or something?
It's probably River Street. It's unclear to me exactly where it was, but I think that's kind of where, you can see where the road curves to the left, and I think that's kind of where 4th Street goes straight now and River Street goes to the
Yeah.
left. I think that's probably where that was.
the between river streets transition where it turns into Fourth, but
Yeah.
then you can go down to
Yeah.
which I always which when I first moved here, I got totally confused by.
Yeah,
Well, you look at all the buildings anyway, maybe it's the housing at the very far end of the picture.
that's right,
There's a
and
lot
that's
of stuff.
Goschen, yeah, yeah.
So I'm wondering, when you look at the width, how far apart the houses are, would that still have been river lot kind of
No.
surveyed
Well,
at that
river
point?
lots did go, like Gary
Yeah, they were.
Abrams, the guy who wrote the first history of PA, says 14 miles along the river were river lots. So they started, they might, yeah, it depends where Sixth Avenue was, because they wouldn't have been on the, although, I shouldn't say that. When the Hudson Bay Company first got that land in 1870, there were people on there with river lots.
Yeah.
And they basically kicked them off. There was a fight about it. I don't know a lot about it. It was kind of too early for the newspapers. But there was disputes about who was on there. So he says there were 14 miles of river lots, and they went almost all the way to Lily Plain out there and started along here.
The bottom right, are those pumpkins?
I don't know. what that
Potatoes
is.
or anything?
Potatoes, cabbages, who knows? I mean, at that time, people would have had to have gardens, had to have cows and chickens, because there really weren't a lot of stores. So they likely would have had big areas.
That's a good question.
What's that?
That was a good question what they were growing.
Yeah. They grew a lot of, I've actually read about that too, that's for a different thing, but they grew a lot of root crops.
Yeah.
Because that was the easiest thing. And of course, you gotta remember, the climate was cooler back then.
Yeah.
So growing, I don't know, corn or something was just about impossible. And root crops grew best and kept the longest, because of course, they didn't have fridges either.
Yeah.
So that was a big part of it. And cabbage was often another thing that they grew. I mean, that was probably common for most of us growing up, that people grew those kind of things. So Isbister settlement didn't develop into a totally permanent place. It kind of quickly melded into the Prince Albert town. Businesses kind of migrated to the Mission because that's where more people were, and we've already talked about Emmanuel College there. James Isbister, after he moved to St. Catharines, he died in 1915, and he's buried at St. Mary's Cemetery. Fred Payton, I don't know if he's gonna do any more tours of St. Mary Church, but if you get a chance, it's really interesting to go through the graveyard there, because those are, I think, the earliest graves in this area are generally at St. Mary's Church. And so this is the sign that's at the west, kind of at the west end of the Rotary Trail. In 2022, they finally put up a sign. So he was designated a person of historic interest in 1997. Credit goes mainly to the Isbister family for doing that. His descendants went on a big campaign, and because initially when PA developed, and as it developed through the 20th century, nobody ever said the name James Isbister. It was all James Nisbet. And Isbister was pretty much totally ignored. And he was the first settler. And the Isbister family really went on a crusade to get him a lot more recognition. But they only erected this plaque in 2022.
I hope that bronze plaque is still there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I took this picture in the winter after it was erected, so
When you say a couple of years ago, you don't put a date on it.
2022,
I was at the unveiling, which was in this.
yeah.
Well, isn't that necessary if you keep this, or? Well, okay. Sorry.
I guess I could have put
It'll
it
still,
on.
it'll still be a couple of years ago in a few years.
Yeah, that's right.
Just last week.
And the Prince Albert Mission, which kind of became the center and sort of won out. Nisbet, of course, just west of the building here is a big cairn that honors Nisbet and the Nisbet Party. And that was done in 1924. So it's very old. It's been fixed since. This is kind of the city as it, or town as it was developing. Some shots of River Street, because River Street was pretty much it. A big muddy track. Yeah, I think it is actually.
Yeah. It is, yeah.
There's Matheson's.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And that's River Street and 11th Street West, so just west, going west of here, that way.
Couldn't get much closer to the river, eh?
Nope, nope. Nobody worried about floodplains.
I was gonna say, what about the floodplain? Yeah.
Now, it took Goshen a much longer time to kind of accommodate to the city, to the Prince Albert. I keep saying city, but really it was a town or village back then. There were all sorts of things that came into play because of the transition. One being, of course, it was a Hudson Bay Company town, and not as independent as the town of Prince Albert. So in 1879, they started actually talking about becoming a town, incorporating so they could tax people and, you know, build sidewalks and a few things like that, provide water and so on. So, and then they wanted a railroad. By this time, railroads were starting to come, so the Trans-Canada was there. And there was a line coming from Capel that they wanted, which eventually did get here in about 1890, I believe, 1890.
Yeah.
So in 1879 they started, and the first map they drew didn't include Goshen. But then Goshen, people of Goshen said, no, 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 we want to be part of the city. So they redrew the map, included Goshen in
It
the
seems to
town.
me, but you don't have a date there, it was much later than that.
What was?
Well, when I was a kid, we talked about the Goshen Gophers, and they didn't seem to belong to the city then, and that,
Oh, they did. In 1885, when the town incorporated, they were part of, Goshen was part of the city. It might have, but it still saw itself separate, right?
well, it was colloquially thought as
Yes,
separate.
yes. But technically, it was part of the city.
Oh, okay.
It was incorporated in the city boundaries right from
But you don't have an
1885.
exact year.
1885, it was
Oh,
incorporated in the
I
city,
In town.
yeah,
So, okay, is town and
Oh,
city?
Prince Albert
There's a
was-
difference?
town. It didn't become a city till
Or
1904.
did not include Goshen, well, then they took a petition to join the city, so
The
it,
first boundaries did not include Goshen, but then they redrew them.
but it still doesn't say when.
Sorry. I was
Am I
trying not to put
stupid or
two
what?
things on my PowerPoint, too many things on my PowerPoint. He started, Lestock Reed started drawing the boundaries of the city in 1879, and somewhere in there, Gary Abrams, who wrote the first book, does not give an exact date of when they included Goshen. He just says the first boundaries did not, and they redrew it and included it in 1885.
Okay.
Best I can do. So, but the telegraph office, they had a big fight over. So the two big
Not
things,
figuratively either,
physically,
physically.
not figuratively. The two big things that people, cities wanted or towns wanted was the railroad and the telegraph. That was the big communication things of the late 19th century. And so the railway they were working on, the telegraph was started in I believe it was 1874, it was in Humboldt.
Yeah.
And Humboldt was a big telegraph office center. They were gonna build a line up here, but then they dithered and dithered on it. Then they built a line over to Clark's Crossing, which you can see when you drive to Saskatoon. Sometimes you still see the Clarkborough Ferry, that's where Clark's Crossing is.
And go to
And-
the original Humboldt thing if you want to see the.
Yeah, and the original Humboldt House, the
Southwestern.
telegraph
Yeah.
office, yeah. And one of the big problems was telegraph poles. Now, I grew up just north of Humboldt, and I can tell you, there's not, the poplars there don't grow that tall. So poles were a problem. Where are you gonna get poles from? And that was a big issue, to get poles to bring the line. And so they couldn't get poles, and then they fought over poles, and then they finally put out a bunch of money. Lawrence Clark, who was the head of the Hudson Bay Company, and another guy in Goschen, put out $1,000 each, which was a lot of money at the time, for telephone poles, or telegraph poles, and they wanted it to end, the office to be in Goschen. Because of course, if you had the telegraph office there, a bunch of businesses would come there,
Yeah.
right? And their property would be worth more money. So that was the big deal. And so at one point, a bunch of guys from the Mission, the Prince Albert Center, went and took down those poles, pulled them out and put them up in a different line leading to Prince Albert. They physically took the poles and did that. And of course, them fist fights started. They ended up in court.
Well, there actually, Connie, I think guns were never drawn, but guns were present
Yeah,
in
it
St.
says at
Paul.
one point there were 300 people outside the courtroom supporting the PA guys who pulled the posts out and brought them to PA. And they thought they might be armed. They were not real sure, but they, you know. And there was drinking. This is apparently liquor flowed like freely. There was 10 days when it apparently was quite tense in this area. There were about 500 people living in the Goschen area, about 500 people in this area, and lots of disagreement about where that telegraph office should go. And the government was just wishy-washying around, and, you know, they were supposed to be the ones building it. But, I mean, nothing has changed really with.
And the Northwest Territories at the time, there wasn't really any government.
This was the federal government that was supposed to be building this, but yeah,
They didn't really have a presence.
They were also supposed to open a land.
and they had some poor sucker who was like, I can't remember, I don't know if I put his name in there. But there was a guy in charge, and of course, I'm sure he had people at him from both sides for months to do this.
Well, at one
He
point,
was dithering,
he was threatened with being tar and feathered.
yeah. Did you write a play about this? Norm?
Yes, I did.
I should have got you to do that. So yeah, so anyway, the government solved the problem by saying, okay, we're gonna build an office in both places. So they did. And then just a few months later, they closed the Goschen one. And so they kind of waited till things simmered down, and the office ended up in PA. That basically cemented PA as the center. Even though the railway had a station here and a station in Goschen for quite a long time, the telegraph office sort of, and then businesses came. And once you have that momentum in one part of town, it's hard to stop it. So that's basically what happened.
Did Goschen ever have their own post office?
Yes, there was a post office there. There was a picture, I didn't put that picture in, but there is a picture. I'm sorry I didn't do that. I have it in.
Because that would be almost as important as the telegraph.
Almost, but yeah. But I think post offices were more common. They were in lots of little places. But yes, it was important. So in 1884, 1884, they got real serious about turning PA into an incorporated town or village. And they had to apply to the government and so on. And Goshen ended up kind of being this center, but it slowly blended into the city, but it was not a separate part of the city. So in 1884, things were actually very difficult in this area at the time. I don't know if you've read any history of the 1885 resistance, but one of the things that happened in 1883 and 84 with crop failures, there was that Krakatoa volcano in the Indonesia area that lowered the temperature over the whole globe for several years. And in a northern area like this, with already a climate that was a bit iffy for agriculture, it was crop failure or very poor crops, and that contributed a lot to the agitation of 1884, 1885, was because people were hungry. And things didn't look good, and their property wasn't worth much. And
The other issue was the land issue.
And then,
That
of course,
federal
the
government
survey.
dragging
Yeah.
their heels on.
Yeah.
All the
So
making
all of that
land.
stuff was happening, and it doesn't take much sometimes to put people over the edge. So they were talking about incorporating into a town, and finally, at the end of 1885, when everything had settled down after the resistance and so on, which kind of settled down in May and June, in October, Prince Albert incorporated into the town that it is, and then it became a city in 1904. So that's the three settlements that became the city. Just before I take questions, if you want, or I'm not an expert on this, obviously people here know lots of stuff too, which is great. This is also going to be an article in the Folklore magazine, if any of you see the Folklore magazine. I figure if I'm going to do all this research, I might as well get the word out there. And a magazine like Folklore hardly is, I've been reading it for years, never has anything about PA. So I got frustrated and I thought, well, I can do that.
Nothing about the
Rarely.
first settlement?
Rarely.
Stanley Mission was the first one,
First settlement in Saskatchewan,
Yeah.
Cumberland House.
wasn't it?
So, anybody got questions?
Do you want to put the lights on or?
You can,
Oh, okay, sorry.
If you want to look at pictures again.
Oh,
How about that? We might as well put the lights on. I have to go there to fix
I have a comment, it's not really a question.
What's that?
I have a comment.
Okay, comments are good.
It's either the 1901 or the 1906 Canada census. There was a pretty big bunch of natives that had come up from the States, and they're in the census. And they were St. Catharines, or not too far past, because I've run across them doing family history. And it's a pretty interesting read.
So they were people who came and settled here?
Well, yeah, like I'm wondering, maybe they're
Homesteads
the
or-
ones that didn't end up out where the Shovel River Bridge crosses, where is that, Wahaton? Because they're not,
Oh, okay, I can, yeah. I just went to Leo Omani's presentation last week, and I sort of learned a lot about the Dakota. So the Dakota were here.
yeah, they're actually showing one of the censuses.
I think the Dene were the earliest.
I don't know.
The
Who was the
Cree,
earliest?
the
The Cree, well, as I said in the very, very beginning, the Cree, the Dene, the Woodland Cree, the Swampy Cree, the Plains Cree, the Dene, and the Dakota were all here, and they were all
But the
coming
Dene, I
to
think,
this
was
area.
first, and the Cree did, they did.
They kind of moved
Killed a lot
west.
of them.
They moved west from further from the woodlands. But the Dakota were here in certainly the 1860s,
Yeah.
at the very earliest.
They came from
And they came, well, the Dakota really were here. I mean, there were lots of Dakota in the US, but there were Dakota here too. This was part of their territory, long before there was a
White
border.
Cap down south of Saskatoon.
Yeah, but I mean, here, they were here.
Yeah.
And they have records of things that they did here from hundreds of years ago. So this was kind of the northern end of their territory, but they were here on a regular basis,
Well,
different.
they came up because the Americans were killing them.
Yeah.
Some did, but some were, this was, at the time they came up because the Americans were killing them was in the 1860s.
Okay.
But, and there was already the border. But before that, like hundreds of years ago, they came to this area.
Oh, okay, I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you mentioned, you used the term English matey and French matey. So when you use that term, are you meaning there were presumably more English men, and then they married or relationships with Indian women,
Yeah.
or and
Yeah.
the
Exactly the
offspring
same
of
way the
Métis?
French did it.
No, but would it have primarily
Same way
been-
everybody does
No,
it.
but would it have primarily been English or French men coming over to
Yeah.
whatever, Prospect Farm, like that?
Well, they call them English Métis, but they were actually Highland Scottish and
Yeah, right,
Orkney
absolutely.
and
So it's
Yeah,
not
there
all
were
the
some
ones that were.
English, but a lot of them were
Right,
Scots.
Scots,
or-
right, so
Yeah.
that's kind of what that term means.
The
Yeah.
English Métis is the term we kind of use now. Back in the original Red
Yeah.
River days, they would call them Métis, the French,
Yeah,
were
right.
just the
Yeah.
French.
Mhm.
And the English ones were called half-breeds.
Yeah,
In
okay.
my
then
day, that's what they were called.
Yeah, and so we just kind of now call them English Métis and French Métis. So it's just a change in terminology, but it's exactly, they usually are descendants of Hudson Bay Company
That's,
workers.
yeah.
The French were descendants of the Northwest Company and those independent traders that came from Quebec.
If you think about it, the two of the largest cities in the province are combinations of two settlements, because Saskatoon is Saskatoon and Sutherland,
Yeah, yeah.
and Prince Edward
Yeah.
is these.
And at the time, when PA was first developing up till the late 1890s, it was the center in Saskatchewan. Saskatoon and Regina were not much.
Well, Regina didn't, well, yeah, it became the administrative
Yeah.
section, but it was just a pile of
PA
homes.
was the place, and then Battleford was the capital of the Northwest Territories. So the kind of northern area, Bill Wazer has written a really good book. He wrote a history of Saskatchewan from 1905, but he wrote I think, even better book that's called,
Before the 1905?
it's called A Land We Have Lost.
Yeah.
And it was about before 1905 and how things shifted from this part, from the north, where the fur trade and forestry and lumbering and all that stuff were the first industries. And then everything shifted south mostly when they built the CPR, and then they divided up and started the homesteading, that things shifted south.
Well, they had to put it through the south because all the people that were anybody had land along there, and that's
That's
where it
right,
had to go
but the
through.
original plan was actually to make it further north. In fact, I just was reading, I don't know if any of you went to the presentation on John Norquay that we had at the library. It was so good. He was a premier Manitoba, so it's like, what's he to us? Except he was an English Métis. He had two brothers-in-law that were here, and he was writing letters back and forth, and it was all, they were all connected, eh?
Mhm.
And so, anyway, one of the things that Gerald Friesen, who's the author of that book, he was a professor at the University of Manitoba, but he grew up here. And he talked a lot about sort of the interconnectedness and how this northern part along the forest fringe was the important part of the Northwest Territories at the time. And at one point, the railroad was supposed to actually go between, like in the Manitoba Interlake,
Mhm.
and then come up here. That was the original route for the CPR. I think it probably would have been underwater by now.
Well, they drained a lot of that land and.
Yeah, they did, but I mean,
Well, if anybody
That's
has,
where 150
Yeah.
years ago.
if anybody has heard of the town of Star City,
Yeah.
that's how it got its name. It was a druggist, Starkey. They took the first part of his, but they thought the railroad was coming
yes,
through here,
yes.
and Star would become a city,
Yeah.
Wow.
Star City. It's a land of about 400 people now, 300.
It's a great little
Had something to do
town.
with the states.
Eh?
It's a great little town.
No.
Pardon?
It's a great little town.
Yeah, oh yeah. That's all.
I don't
Any
even call
other
it a
questions or
religious town.
comments?
The house that I live in at the moment, was originally constructed by a right for a William Christie, who was listed as a Dominion land surveyor.
Yeah.
So he was camped here and then the house was built in 1907, so I don't know where he lived before that or whatever, but he was obviously busy around the area.
There were a couple little boom times. One was in the early, like before that 1883 volcano. There was about 79, 80, 81 when they started surveying and stuff. There was a little boom. You know, people were buying land, they're gonna survey, because the Homestead Act had already been, was 1872, so settlers followed the Homestead Act when it was surveyed. That's when they started coming. And so people were like, oh, I'm gonna buy this land and then I can sell it in a couple of years and blah, blah, blah. So there was a little boom and then a big crash.
There was a boom, but then there was no way to register your land.
Yeah, there were lots of
So
problems.
there was
yeah.
no,
And so, yeah,
the value went down.
yeah. There were a whole series of letters and petitions and things that went from here to the federal government in the 1882, 83, 84. There's a whole big store of these things that went back and forth, mostly to do with bad farming and land costs and can't register and
Yeah.
we don't have any services here.
A lot of
We can't-
pressure.
We can't get title to our land, we can't do this, we can't do that. And that, again, contributed to the 1885.
It's just some of the earliest examples of the federal government,
Yeah, well, like I said,
we don't need to deal
it's
with
not,
it.
a lot of things haven't changed.
That's right.
Anyway, thank you very much for coming.
You did a great
There's
job.
more coffee, there's more cookies.
Thanks
And there's more
Sharon.
conversation.